Welcome again to the Melling Law YouTube channel, where we talk about different estate planning topics relevant to people living in Utah. Today we're extending our series about managing other people's money. We've already covered many of the types of hats someone might wear in managing other people's money, whether they're serving as a trustee of a living trust, whether they're serving as an agent under a power of attorney, or whether they are serving as a conservator of someone else's property, which is a court-appointed process. In whatever capacity you might be managing money for others, there are different types of assets that are treated differently under Utah law. So today we are going to talk about financial accounts. And in financial accounts, we're talking about anything that's either managed by a bank or by any kind of financial institution like investment type accounts, or an insurance policy. As far as proxy decision making goes, or someone who's making the decisions on behalf of another, many of the issues with these types of assets are very similar. So we want to go into that. First of all is the validity of your documents. The simplest type of management of money for somebody else is either a conservatorship, because you've got letters from the court showing your authority, or a power of attorney, not a power of attorney, that's the worst one, the successor trustee on a living trust. If the living trust owns the account instead of the individual, you are just stepping into the shoes of the new manager of that trust whenever the person has lost capacity to sign for that. And that trust should be accepted by pretty much any financial institution. They're fairly familiar with that, and usually if they are putting the trust on as the owner of the account while the person still had capacity and was living, during that process they would have made copies of the trust or the certificate of trust to determine which powers you as the successor trustee would have had anyway. The trust process is much more efficient than the conservatorship process, because conservatorships are through the courts, but both of them are pretty easy to work with as far as having a relationship with that financial institution and getting that financial institution to recognize your ability to manage those assets. Where we run into trouble is with the powers of attorney. Now, a power of attorney document, while under Utah law, does not expire and is effective as to any banking powers, including lending on or taking lines of credit on the assets within the bank account. That still is not fully recognized by institutions in this state, just because they are trying to protect themselves and look out for their clients, and they're worried about fraud. So there's always a balance there, and because of that, powers of attorney are a little bit harder to work with as far as an institution. And banks, of the different types of institutions to work with a power of attorney, banks are actually the easiest. It gets even harder when you're dealing with investment companies, and still harder when you're dealing with life insurance companies. With as far as your powers go, we touched on banking powers. Investment powers are very similar as far as buying and selling investments. There are some kinds of investments that might be a little trickier if you're dealing with annuitized investments or anything that has some kind of tax savings or tax deferral element to it. Especially the ones that are governed by federal law, because then we're dealing with federal regulations, but the proxy decision-making documents are on a state level. And then finally, we have a lot of issues when it comes to the life insurance. You can request those funds or make payments to the life insurance policy, but as far as any kind of beneficiary designation or any kind of alteration, it's much more difficult to deal with those types of policies through a power of attorney than it is just while the person was living and could deal with it themselves. So if you have questions about the types of powers you have as an agent or as a successor trustee over financial accounts, those are defined by statute. Now, when it comes to the ethical issues, those are a little bit trickier because they're not necessarily defined in statute. They are not defined by law. They are kind of defined by the court process and by common practice of law enforcement and of prosecutors and of civil courts. But in general, when it comes to ethical issues with managing money for others, you want to the number one thing that you want to avoid is self-dealing. For example, oftentimes I see son or daughter living with mom and dad. Mom and dad lose capacity to sign for anything. The successor trustee steps in, who is the son or daughter living with mom and dad, or maybe they have a power of attorney. And they had a certain way of dealing with bills and spending money while mom and dad had capacity to sign. Maybe mom and dad would be the ones buying groceries, but then son or daughter would cover the bill for the TV, or whatever kind of arrangement they had. However, as soon as mom and dad are incapacitated, son or daughter has a fiduciary duty to them to act in their best interests. So any kind of self-dealing, meaning any kind of benefit to son or daughter, needs to stop unless specifically authorized in that power of attorney. For example, let's say if mom and dad always bought the groceries and they bought groceries for $3, you need to start buying your own groceries and just use their money to only buy the food that they are going to use. Same thing for a lot of these utilities. If mom and dad are in a facility but you're staying in their house, you probably need to cover their utilities because you're the one using them. So there are a lot of these issues that you need to look out for if you are, especially if you're living in their home. If you're living away from their home, it's a little easier to avoid some of those ethical issues that come with self-dealing. Just make sure that you're keeping accountings and that you are not spending the money on yourself. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions about how to manage money for a loved one, feel free to give us a call at any time.